My name is Margaret. I'm 64 years old, and for 3 long years, I let my son and his materialistic wife believe I was a poor, grieving widow teetering on the edge of destitution. The charade all came to a spectacular, crashing end when my daughter-in-law, in the middle of what was supposed to be a peaceful family dinner, screamed at me to get a real job and stop being a leech. She had no idea that I was not only worth over $7 million, but that I also owned the very house she was living in, the car she drove, and indirectly, the very job that funded her lavish lifestyle. The fallout from that single sentence didn't just expose her for the conniving predator she was, it triggered a chain of events involving private investigators, secret recordings, a dramatic police confrontation, and a painful truth that would either shatter my family or save it from itself. This story is a difficult one to tell, but I feel it's a story that needs to be heard. It's about the quiet betrayals that happen behind closed doors and the strength it takes to fight back. I'm curious to see how far it travels around the world. If you have a moment, I'd love for you to comment with the city or country you're in right now and maybe what time it is. It's a small thing, but it helps me feel connected, to know I'm not alone in sharing this. It all began 3 years ago, on a gray, soul-crushingly bleak Tuesday afternoon that smelled of rain and fading lilies. The funeral was over. The last of the well-meaning relatives had murmured their final hushed condolences, squeezed my hand with a pitying look, and left me alone in the echoing silence of the life I had so carefully built with my husband Richard. We had been married for 42 years, a lifetime. For 30 of those years, we weren't just husband and wife. We were partners in the truest sense of the word. We had taken a single, risky investment in a forgotten parcel of land and spun it into a commercial real estate empire, a portfolio of properties that dotted the city skyline. Richard was the heart of the operation, the visionary, a man with a booming laugh and a charm that could sell a dream to the most hardened skeptic. I was the brain, the strategist. I was the one who read the hundreds of pages of fine print, who managed the numbers with an iron will, and who understood that true power wasn't in the flashy car or the big house, but in what you held in reserve, in the moves you made when no one was watching. That afternoon, I found myself not in our sprawling home with the English garden Richard had so lovingly tended, but in the sterile, wood-paneled downtown office of our longtime lawyer and trusted friend, James Harrison. He was a kind, solemn man with weary eyes that had seen too many families torn apart by grief and greed. He slid a thick, leather-bound binder across the polished mahogany table, its weight seeming to absorb the light in the room. "Margaret," he said, his voice a soft rumble, "everything is in order. The estate, the business holdings, all liquid assets, it's all yours now. We're looking at a net worth north of $7 million after all estate taxes are settled." I didn't open the binder. I didn't need to. I knew every number, every decimal point, every asset and liability within it by heart. I had helped create it from nothing. Instead, my gaze drifted to the floor-to-ceiling window looking out at a cityscape that Richard and I had literally helped shape, building by building. "I'm selling the house, James," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, devoid of the tremor I felt in my soul. He blinked, his professional composure momentarily rattled. "But Margaret, that's your home. 40 years of your life, all your memories with Richard." "Memories don't pay the bills," I said, the lie feeling foreign and cheap on my tongue. I was testing the words, seeing how they fit. I turned my gaze from the window and met his eyes. My expression had shifted, the soft grief hardening into a look he recognized from our most difficult contract negotiations. "I need your help, James." I need you to set up a blind trust. I want to purchase a small, completely unremarkable apartment in a modest neighborhood under a corporate name. I want to open a new, separate bank account with just enough deposited to cover simple living expenses. As far as the world, and most importantly, as far as my family is concerned, Margaret Holloway is about to become a destitute widow struggling to make ends meet after her husband left behind a mountain of secret debt. James Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, a deep furrow forming between his brows. Margaret, what is this all about? This is extreme. If you're worried about Thomas and how he'll handle things, I'm not worried about Thomas, I corrected him, my voice dropping to a near whisper. I'm worried about his wife. I'm worried about Victoria. My son Thomas was a good man at his core. He had his father's kind heart and gentle nature, but none of his steel spine. He was a talented artist, a dreamer, but he was also pliable, easily led. And for the past 5 years, since the day he'd brought her home, he had been led by Victoria. She was undeniably beautiful, with a polished veneer and an ambition that burned so brightly it was almost blinding. She came from a family with a well-known name, but empty pockets, and she wore her desire for wealth and status like a second skin. The moment that crystallized my doubt, the moment this entire plan was born, was at Richard's funeral. In the midst of my suffocating grief, while I was shaking hands and accepting hugs from people who genuinely loved my husband, Victoria had pulled me aside. Her eyes were wide with what she intended me to perceive as deep concern. "Oh, Margaret," she'd sighed, her manicured fingers clutching my arm. "I know this is a terrible time to even think about it, but have you given any thought to the inheritance? Richard was always so generous, such a good provider. Thomas and I just want to make sure you're protected financially." The word inheritance hung in the air between us, ugly and grasping. She hadn't shared a single fond memory of the man who had treated her like a daughter. She hadn't asked how my heart was holding up. She had gone straight for the bottom line. It was in that moment, standing beside my husband's casket, that I heard Richard's voice in my head, a warning he had given me years ago. "Maggie, always watch the ones who talk about money when they should be talking about love. Their hearts are calculators." "This isn't just about pretending to be poor, James," I continued, my voice low and intense. "This is an investigation, a 3-year investigation, if that's what it takes. I have to know who will stand by me when they think I have nothing left to offer. I have to know if my son still has a soul of his own, or if his wife has purchased it with promises of a lifestyle he can't afford."
James was silent for a long, heavy moment. He knew me well enough to understand that my mind was a fortress. Once a decision was made, it was unbreachable. He finally gave a slow, reluctant nod, a flicker of grim understanding in his tired eyes. "All right, Margaret. We'll set up the blind trust. We'll buy the apartment. We'll create the illusion. But you must promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Don't lose yourself in the role you're playing," he warned, his voice heavy. "Don't forget who you are, what you've built. This kind of deception, it can eat away at you." I allowed myself a thin, humorless smile. "Oh, I'll remember who I am, James," I said. "But I have a feeling that by the time this is over, they're the ones who will have forgotten." And so the curtain rose on the greatest, most painful performance of my life. I sold our beautiful home, telling the family that the profits were swallowed by Richard's hidden business debts, a complete and utter fabrication. I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment with worn-out carpets and appliances that hummed a sad, monotonous tune. I boxed up my designer wardrobe, the clothes of a successful woman, and delivered them to a charity consignment shop. My new closet was filled with faded blouses and shapeless cardigans from thrift stores. I sold my gleaming luxury car and learned the city's bus routes. I became the woman Victoria had always secretly believed I was. Small, invisible, and on the verge of becoming a burden. And for 3 long, soul-crushing years, I watched, I listened, and I documented every single lie, every slight, every betrayal. I was a strategist setting a very long, very patient trap. Living the lie was an exercise in meticulous, grinding discipline. Every morning, I would wake up in the small, drab apartment that always smelled faintly of dust and disappointment. I'd make coffee in a chipped ceramic mug, the bitter taste a fitting start to my day. Then, while the city outside my window hummed with life, I would sit at my rickety kitchen table, open a secure laptop I kept hidden in a false bottom drawer, and manage my empire. I was still Margaret Holloway, the CEO. I was making million-dollar decisions, orchestrating deals, and reviewing investment portfolios, all while dressed in a faded housecoat. It was a surreal, bifurcated existence. My son, Thomas, would call dutifully once a week, usually on a Sunday evening. "Hi, Mom, just checking in. How are you holding up?" His voice always had that strained, hollow quality, as if he were reading from a script. I could picture him perfectly, sitting on the edge of his designer sofa, phone on speaker, while Victoria moved about in the background, listening to every word, her presence a constant, suffocating pressure. He'd offer vague promises of help, of stopping by during the week, but they rarely materialized. There was always a last-minute meeting, a project with a tight deadline. I knew they were her excuses, not his. Victoria's methods were far more insidious. She rarely called me directly. She didn't need to. She was a master of poisoning the well, of controlling the narrative from a distance. I would hear her influence trickling back to me from other corners of the family, like a slow-acting toxin. My sister-in-law, Patricia, Richard's younger sister, called me one afternoon. "Margaret, I was just on the phone with Victoria," she said, her voice laced with concern. "She mentioned you seemed a bit down, that you weren't eating properly. Is everything all right, dear? You know you can talk to me." I assured her I was fine, but the call left a bitter taste in my mouth. A bit down, not eating properly. They were such small, believable lies painted with the brush of concern. The most telling incident came via Thomas's Aunt Susan, a notorious family gossip who thrived on drama. I called her to wish her a happy birthday. After the initial pleasantries, her tone shifted, becoming syrupy with pity. "Oh, Margaret dear," she sighed, and I could practically hear her shaking her head. "I was just talking to that lovely Victoria the other day. She is just an absolute angel, you know. So worried about you." "Is she?" I asked, my voice neutral. "Oh, completely. She said you seem to be, well, how did she put it? Losing your grip a little, forgetting appointments, misplacing things. She said she's terrified you'll have a fall in that little apartment of yours. She's a saint, I tell you, a saint for putting up with it all and trying to manage you." My hand tightened on the phone until my knuckles were white. Manage me? The audacity was breathtaking. She wasn't just expressing concern, she was actively, methodically building a case. She was laying the groundwork brick by brick for the narrative of a frail, elderly woman with a declining mental state. It was a classic chilling strategy for someone who might, down the line, want to gain control over a person's life or their assets. I knew then that this wasn't just about greed, it was about power. The most painful part of it all was watching what her influence was doing to my son. Thomas was a genuinely talented graphic designer, but he lacked the cutthroat ambition necessary to climb the corporate ladder. The marketing firm where he worked, a place called Innovate Creative, was one I knew intimately. Richard and I had been early investors in the parent company. After Thomas graduated with his art degree, I had made a quiet, off-the-record call to the CEO, an old acquaintance, to ensure Thomas's resume landed on the right desk for a good starting position. He had earned every promotion since on his own merit, but it was that initial push, that invisible hand that had opened the door. He never knew. He and Victoria lived in a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a desirable suburb, a house they believed they were barely affording on his salary. They had no idea that I had purchased it for them outright as a wedding gift through a shell company I controlled. The property management firm that collected their monthly checks was just another one of my corporate entities. They thought they were paying a mortgage. In reality, every penny they paid in rent was funneled directly into a high-yield trust fund I had established for their future children, a college fund, and a nest egg for a future I wanted for my grandchildren. But Victoria didn't see it as a foundation. She saw it as a cage. One evening, about 2 years into my experiment, I was at their house for a rare holiday dinner. Victoria was parading a new, ridiculously expensive watch on her wrist. It was an anniversary present from Tommy, she announced loudly, shooting a pointed look at me. He got that big bonus after his last project. I knew for a fact there had been no bonus. I still had access to the company's financials. Later, while I was helping clear the dishes, a role I was always expected to perform, I overheard them arguing in the kitchen. Her voice was a sharp, furious whisper. I don't know how much longer I can do this, Thomas. Your salary is a joke. We're living paycheck to paycheck in this stupid little house. My friends are going to Tuscany for the summer. Their husbands are partners in their firms. What am I? I'm a glorified housewife with a mountain of student divorce debt from my art history degree and a mother-in-law who's going to end up on our doorstep any day now. It's not that bad, Vic. Thomas's voice was weary, defeated. We're comfortable. Comfortable? She'd shriek, the whisper forgotten. I'm not interested in comfortable. I want the life I deserve, the life you promised me. If you had just gotten that creative director promotion. I slipped away from the kitchen door, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. The house, she called stupid and little, was worth nearly $500,000. The salary she scorned was well into the six figures. She wasn't struggling, she was drowning in her own insatiable greed. And she saw me not as family, but as the final, humiliating weight that would drag her under. From that day forward, the slights became more frequent, the cruelty less subtle. She would make comments about my thrift store clothes in front of her friends. Oh, bless her heart, she does her best with what she has. She would forget to set a proper place for me at the table, handing me mismatched, cheap cutlery with a dismissive smile. They were small, deliberate acts of humiliation designed to reinforce my status as a powerless, dependent outsider. And my son? My kind, gentle Thomas, he saw it all. I would catch his eye across the dinner table, and he would quickly look away, a deep, painful flicker of shame on his face. But he never once spoke up. He never once said, "That's enough, Victoria." His desire for a peaceful life with his wife, no matter how toxic, had completely eclipsed his loyalty to his mother. He had made his choice, and every day it felt like a fresh betrayal, a small death of the son I once knew. I documented it all in my journal. Every slight, every manipulative phone call I learned about, every time my son chose silence over me. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about clarity. It was my evidence file, my testament to the truth. I didn't know yet how or when I would use it, but I knew the day of reckoning was coming. A lifetime in business had taught me one fundamental truth. Every bubble, no matter how beautiful or convincing, eventually bursts. And Victoria's bubble of lies, greed, and breathtaking arrogance was stretched to its absolute limit. The invitation that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning. It was late October, and the air had that particular kind of biting chill that promises a long, hard winter is on its way. "Mom?" Thomas's voice on the phone was thin and strained, stretched taut by the presence of his wife, who I could practically picture standing beside him, arms crossed, mouthing the words. "We were wondering if you'd like to come over for dinner on Friday night. Victoria's making her famous lasagna." Famous? A bitter laugh almost escaped my lips. The woman's culinary skills were so limited, she considered preheating the oven an accomplishment. But I played my part, the role I had perfected over 3 years. That sounds lovely, sweetheart. What time should I be there? 7:30, he said. Then came the inevitable pause, the moment where he took his instructions. I heard a sharp, insistent whisper in the background. And Mom, he continued, his voice laced with manufactured casualness, maybe, could you dress up a little? Something nice. Victoria is trying to make a good impression on the new neighbors who just moved in next door, and she wants everything to look, presentable. Presentable. The word hung in the air long after I'd hung up the phone. It was a dagger wrapped in velvet. For 3 years, I had been unpresentable. My simple bun of gray hair, my makeup-free face, my collection of faded cardigans, it was a uniform of poverty I had chosen, a costume for my investigation. But to hear it framed as a social embarrassment by my own son, to be told I was a liability to his wife's social climbing, it was a new and profound kind of sting. This dinner was different. I could feel it in my bones, a low hum of certainty. This dinner was going to be the end of something, the end of my patience, the end of my silence. On Friday night, I walked the 6 blocks to their house. I had deliberately chosen not to take the bus, wanting the cold, sharp air to clear my head and fortify my resolve. The house looked beautiful, a beacon of warmth and light against the encroaching twilight. The house I had bought. The house I was paying the taxes on. The irony was a physical weight in my chest. I rang the bell, and Thomas opened the door. He wore a forced, brittle smile that didn't reach his eyes. He gave me a quick, obligatory hug that felt more like a pat on the back. Victoria appeared in the dining room doorway, a vision of calculated perfection in a sharp black silk dress that I knew, from a quick glance, cost more than my entire monthly budget. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my neat but simple black trousers and cashmere sweater. It wasn't a thrift store cardigan, but it was a universe away from her designer standards. Her lips thinned into a bloodless line of disapproval. "Eileen, glad you could make it." Her tone implied I had narrowly avoided being turned away at the door. The dining room was a masterclass in passive aggression. The table was set with their best china in gleaming silver, except for my place setting. I noticed it immediately, as I was meant to. My plate was a slightly different pattern, a cheaper ceramic. My water glass was a thick, heavy tumbler, a stark contrast to their delicate, long-stemmed crystal goblets. My fork had a slight, almost imperceptible bend in one of the tines. It was a petty, meticulously planned insult, a clear and silent signal that I was the lesser guest at this table, an outsider who didn't belong. I took my seat without comment, my face a mask of placid neutrality. The conversation, or what passed for it, was stilted and painful. Thomas talked nervously about his job, carefully avoiding the fact that he'd been passed over for a major promotion, for the 2nd time that year. But Victoria held court. She dominated the evening with breathless accounts of her yoga retreats, her shopping trips for investment pieces, and her grand plans to completely redecorate the living room. "We simply have to get rid of all this outdated furniture. It's so suburban. I'm thinking something more minimalist, more sophisticated." I remembered the day I had picked out that very sofa with them, right after they were married. Victoria had gushed about how perfect it was, how it made the house feel like a real home. Now, like me, it was outdated and needed to be replaced. "That sounds expensive," I said, my voice mild. Victoria's eyes flashed with irritation. "Well, some people," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "understand that you have to invest in quality to project a certain image. It's about self-respect, really." The barb was aimed directly at me, a missile of contempt. I took another bite of the salty, undercooked lasagna and said nothing. I was a coiled spring, a predator waiting in the tall grass. My patience had worn thin, and it was about to snap. Then
Thomas cleared his throat, a nervous, fluttering sound. He glanced at his wife, who gave her a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. The ambush was about to begin. Actually, Mom, we wanted to talk to you about something. Victoria leaned forward, her face a carefully constructed mask of deep, loving concern. Eileen, she cooed, we're so worried about you. It's been 3 years since Richard's funeral, and you're just not getting back on your feet. You're barely making ends meet in that tiny apartment. I'm managing just fine, I said quietly. Are you, though? Victoria's voice was as smooth and sweet as honey, but her words were laced with poison. You can't afford a car. You shop at thrift stores. Let's be honest, you're completely dependent on us for everything. Dependent on you? The lie was so audacious, so breathtakingly false. It was almost impressive. I hadn't taken a single dime from them. But in her twisted reality, my very existence was a burden she was heroically shouldering. She took a deep breath, puffing up her chest for the final, grand pronouncement, the solution she had so brilliantly devised. What we're trying to say is, it's time you thought about your future. You're only 64. You need to have some purpose, some independence, some dignity. She paused for dramatic effect, looking from Thomas to me, her eyes gleaming with triumph. What I think you should do is get a real job and stop being a leech. The words, sharp, ugly, and unforgivable, echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of the room. Thomas stared down at his plate, his face ashen. Victoria, however, looked immensely pleased with herself, as if she had just solved world hunger. I didn't cry, I didn't shout. A strange, glacial calm washed over me. The investigation was over. The final piece of data had been collected. I had my answer. I slowly placed my bent fork on my cheap plate, looked directly into the triumphant eyes of my daughter-in-law, and for the first time in 3 long years, I let her see the steel behind my gaze. I smiled. No, I said, my voice soft but carrying the unmistakable weight of a judge's gavel. I don't think I'll be doing that. I stood up from the table, my movements deliberate and graceful. Thank you for dinner, Victoria. The lasagna was exactly what I expected. I turned and walked towards the front door, my composure absolute, my back straight. Behind me, I heard her hiss to Thomas, her voice a furious whisper. What is wrong with her? Did she just threaten me? At the door, I paused and turned back to face them. They were both standing there, watching me, Victoria's face a storm cloud of fury and confusion. Oh, and Victoria? I said, my voice as cold and clear as a winter morning. A piece of advice. You might want to start updating your own resume. I opened the door and stepped out into the biting night air, leaving her in a house she didn't know wasn't hers, with a future that was about to crumble into dust. I looked up at the starless sky. The tipping point had been reached. Now it was time for the avalanche. For 2 full days, there was a profound and unnerving silence from my son's house. I knew what that silence meant. It was the eye of the storm. Victoria would be fuming, pacing her living room, dissecting my every word, twisting my parting shot into a declaration of war. I could picture her railing at Thomas, demanding that he handle me, that he force me to apologize, to explain my bizarre and disrespectful behavior. She would be working on him, reinforcing her narrative that I was ungrateful, unstable, and a threat to their perfect life. The call came finally on the 3rd day, a gray and dreary Sunday afternoon. Mom? Thomas's voice was cautious, hesitant, as if he were trying to coax a frightened animal out of hiding. Can we talk? I'd like to come over to your apartment. This was a significant development. A first. In 3 years, he had never once set foot inside my small, carefully curated world of poverty.
He had dropped off groceries at the door on a handful of occasions, always with a rushed excuse, but he had never crossed the threshold. The thought of him seeing my squalor up close had always been something he, or more accurately, Victoria, had fastidiously avoided. It would have made the lie too real for him. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, keeping my tone gentle, betraying none of the cold resolve that had settled in my heart. "I'll put on a pot of coffee." I spent the next hour preparing, not just the apartment, but myself. I fluffed the worn-out cushions on the lumpy armchair. I made sure the chipped mugs were front and center on the counter. I put on my most faded, shapeless gray cardigan. It was all part of the stagecraft. But in the back of my cupboard, hidden behind a box of cheap, generic tea bags, I pulled out a small, vacuum-sealed bag of expensive, gourmet coffee beans. A dark, rich Sumatran blend. It was his favorite, the kind I used to buy for him and his father on Saturday mornings when he was a teenager. It was a small, secret act of love, a reminder of a time before Victoria, a time when he was still mine. When he arrived, his eyes swept over my tiny living room, and I saw the wince of pity he tried to hide. He looked deeply uncomfortable, a man in a tailored coat standing in a world he couldn't comprehend. "Mom, this place is," he finally managed, his voice trailing off as he struggled for a word that wasn't insulting. "It's cozy," I supplied, handing him a steaming mug. It was one of my good ones, a piece of fine, thin porcelain that I kept hidden for myself. "Here, be careful, it's hot." He took a tentative sip of the coffee, and his eyes widened in genuine surprise. "Wow, this is really good coffee. Where did you get this?" "I splurge sometimes," I said simply, letting the statement hang in the air. We sat at my small, wobbly kitchen table, a relic from a secondhand store. The silence between us was heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and years of neglect. "About Friday night," he began, staring intently into his cup, as if the answers were swirling in the dark liquid. "Victoria is really, really upset. She thinks you threatened her." I met his gaze and held it, refusing to let him look away. I didn't respond to her statement about Victoria. Her feelings were irrelevant. Instead, I asked a question that put the responsibility squarely back on him. "What do you think, Thomas?" He shifted in his chair, the legs scraping against the worn linoleum. He couldn't look at me. "I don't know what to think anymore, Mom. You haven't been yourself lately. You've been distant, strange, and then Friday, the way you looked at her, the things you said." "The way I looked at her?" I pressed gently, refusing to let him off the hook. "Or the things I said?" "Both," he admitted, his voice a low mumble. "Telling her to update her resume? What was that even supposed to mean? It was cruel." It was time, not for the full, devastating truth, but for the first hairline crack in the dam of his denial. "Thomas," I said, my voice soft, almost clinical, "I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I need you to answer them with absolute honesty. Not what you think you should say, or what Victoria would want you to say. Just the simple, unvarnished truth. Can you do that for me?" He looked up, his eyes wary, but he nodded reluctantly.
Okay. I took a deep breath. "In the last 3 years, since your father's funeral, when was the last time your wife asked me a single question about my life? My friends, my interests, how I spend my days, that wasn't directly related to my financial situation or my health?" He opened his mouth, a protest ready on his lips, then he closed it, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had no answer. Question 2. When was the last time she suggested that you and I spend an afternoon together, just the two of us? Go to a museum, have lunch, like we used to, without her. The silence stretched, becoming more uncomfortable. Question 3. When was the last time you witnessed her treat me with genuine warmth or respect? I'm not talking about the brittle for show politeness she puts on in front of her friends. I mean genuine human kindness. He stared at the table, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his coffee mug. His denial was beginning to crumble. And this is the most important question of all, sweetheart, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, filled with the pain of 1,000 tiny cuts. When was the last time you saw her being dismissive, condescending, or downright cruel to me, and you stood up for me? When did you ever say, "That's enough, Victoria. Don't speak to my mother that way"? A single, hot tear rolled down his cheek and splashed onto the tabletop. It was the sound of a dam breaking. He choked out, the words thick with shame. I didn't realize. I didn't think it was that bad. Or you chose not to see it. I finished for him, my voice gentle but firm. You chose not to see it because it was easier than confronting her. It was easier to have a peaceful life. This was the moment of truth for my son. I could see the terrible war raging in his eyes, years of his wife's insidious psychological influence battling against the fundamental decency and love that I knew, I prayed, was still buried deep inside him. She's not a bad person, Mom, he mumbled, a last desperate attempt to defend the life he had built, the woman he had chosen. She's very stressed about money, about the promotion I didn't get. She feels a lot of pressure. Money, I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. It always comes back to money, doesn't it? I stood up, my movement slow and deliberate. I walked to the dusty bookshelf in the corner, a piece of furniture I'd bought for $5 at a yard sale. Behind a row of tattered paperback novels, I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I placed it on the table in front of him with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the small room. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for it. He opened the folder. His eyes widened. He began to flip through pages, his breath catching in his throat. Each page turned faster, more frantic than the last. Inside were not theories or accusations. Inside was the cold, hard, irrefutable truth. Financial statements from Morgan Stanley, deeds to a portfolio of commercial properties downtown, account summaries from a private bank in Geneva. The numbers were staggering, incomprehensible. A reality so far removed from this shabby little apartment that it felt like a hallucination. "Mom, what is this?" he whispered, his face utterly pale with shock, his voice a stranger's. I don't understand." I sat back down, took a slow, deliberate sip of my own coffee, and looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the man I was now desperately trying to save from himself. "That, sweetheart," I said calmly, my voice clear and steady amidst the ruins of his reality, "is who I really am. Your father and I were very successful. When he died, I inherited everything. I am worth approximately $7 million. The color drained completely from his face. He stared at me, then at the folder, then at the peeling linoleum on the floor, then back at me. The carefully constructed world he thought he knew, the world where his mother was a burden and his wife was a saint, had just been vaporized. But this place, the clothes, the bus, why? Why would you do this? I held his gaze, my own eyes finally filling with the tears I had held back for 3 years. "Because, Thomas," I said, my voice breaking with the accumulated weight of 1,000 days of pain and deception,
Because, Thomas, I needed to know who would still love me when they thought I had absolutely nothing left to give. Thomas couldn't process it. He just sat there, frozen, staring at the folder as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the table between us. The multi-million-dollar numbers on the pages seemed to scream in defiance of the threadbare armchair in the corner, the peeling paint on the kitchen cabinets. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, with a dawning horror that was quickly being eclipsed by a profound, soul-deep confusion. "You've been testing us," he said, the words barely audible, a puff of air in the silent room. "This whole time, this entire 3 years, it's been a test." "It started as a test, yes," I corrected him gently, my voice still thick with emotion. "It quickly became a survival strategy. I wasn't just testing you, Thomas. I was protecting myself. I was protecting your father's legacy from people like your wife." She's not a bad person." He started to protest out of pure ingrained habit, but the words died on his lips. He couldn't say it anymore. He couldn't defend her. The evidence of my wealth was too stark, too overwhelming. It recontextualized every single one of her complaints, every one of her sighs about money, every one of her condescending remarks. They weren't the words of a stressed-out wife. They were the words of a greedy, dissatisfied predator. But I wasn't finished. The shock of my wealth was only the first layer of the deception I had to unravel for him. Now I had to show him the true depth of the rot beneath the surface. I said, my voice hardening, "She didn't just fail the test, sweetheart. She tried to cheat. She got impatient." I reached back into the bookshelf and pulled out a second, thinner folder. This one was labeled simply VH Project. I opened it and slid a single piece of paper across the wobbly table. It was a professionally formatted invoice from a licensed private investigator. 2 months ago, I started to get the distinct feeling that Victoria's campaign of whispers about my mental decline was becoming more organized, more strategic. She was no longer just complaining, she was building a case. So I hired someone to find out why. He looked at the paper, his brow furrowed in confusion. "You hired a private investigator? To do what? Spy on Victoria?" "To investigate. There's a difference. I wanted to know if she was just a materialistic, unkind person, or if there was something more malicious at play." I pushed another document towards him. It was a printout of a chain of emails between Victoria and a man named Lawrence Albright, a lawyer whose website proclaimed him to be a specialist in elder law and asset protection. The subject line of the first email was "Urgent and confidential family matter, consultation request." His eyes scanned the text, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. "Dear Mr. Albright," the email began, Victoria's professional, concerned tone a chilling mockery. "I am writing to you under extremely sensitive and painful circumstances. My mother-in-law, a recent widow, has been exhibiting increasing and alarming signs of cognitive decline, paranoia, and an inability to manage her daily affairs. I am deeply concerned for her welfare and her ability to manage her finances. My husband and I fear she is vulnerable. I would like to schedule an urgent consultation to discuss the legal process for obtaining guardianship over an elderly relative, particularly regarding the necessary steps to secure and manage their assets to prevent outside exploitation." Thomas dropped the paper as if it had physically burned him. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "No, she wouldn't. This has to be fake." "She would, and she did," I said, my voice as hard and cold as stone.
And this, my dear son, is where it gets infinitely worse. As if on cue, my phone, the cheap, disposable flip phone I used for my charade, began to ring with a tinny, annoying jingle. I glanced at the caller ID. It was an unknown number. My heart began to pound, a sudden premonitory dread washing over me. Something told me to answer it. "Hello?" I said, my voice steady. "Yes, may I please speak with Margaret Holloway?" A smooth, professional male voice asked. "This is she. Who is calling?" "My name is Lawrence Albright. I'm an attorney specializing in elder care. I was given your number by your daughter-in-law, Victoria." My blood went cold. It was him, the lawyer from the emails. Victoria had given him my number. This was it. This was her next move, happening right now, in real time. She was escalating. My eyes locked on my son's terrified face. I made a split-second decision. I pressed the speakerphone button. "I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong person," I said, my voice firm. "I haven't requested any legal consultation." "Ah, my apologies," the man said, his voice a slick, condescending purr. "There must have been a mix-up in my notes. Your daughter-in-law, Victoria, expressed grave concern for your well-being. She believes you may be the victim of financial abuse, possibly by your son, Thomas. She was hoping I could speak with you to assess the situation and see if we can offer some assistance." The sheer diabolical brilliance of her plan almost took my breath away. She wasn't just trying to have me declared incompetent. She was trying to frame my own son as an abuser to do it. She would position herself as the hero, the savior, sweeping in to protect me from the clutches of my greedy son, thereby gaining control of what she thought was a modest but still significant life insurance payout, and whatever other assets she could find. I looked at Thomas. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He finally, truly understood. I decided to play along for one more moment, to see how deep the rabbit hole went. I let a note of manufactured confusion and fear into my voice. "Financial abuse? By my Thomas? I don't understand." "It's a very common and tragic situation, Mrs. Holloway," the lawyer cooed, the false sympathy dripping from his words. "Victoria is simply trying to protect your inheritance and ensure you receive the care you need." That was enough, I said, my voice suddenly clear and sharp as glass, all pretense of confusion gone. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Albright, but I can assure you I am perfectly fine. My assets are perfectly secure, and I will be speaking to my actual lawyer, Mr. James Harrison, about this unsolicited and highly inappropriate phone call. Do not contact me again. Goodbye." I snapped the flip phone shut. The silence that descended upon the tiny apartment was suffocating, absolute. The ticking clock I'd felt earlier was now a deafening fire alarm ringing in my ears. This wasn't a future threat. This wasn't a plan she was considering. It was happening right now. Victoria was actively, at this very moment, trying to strip me of my rights and have my son branded a criminal. Thomas looked at me, the last vestiges of his denial, his hope, his love for his wife, completely vaporized by the searing heat of her ultimate betrayal. The boy was gone. In his place sat a man with a cold, dangerous fire in his eyes that I hadn't seen since he was a child who had been wronged on the playground. "Mom," he said, his voice low, guttural, and shaking with a controlled rage. "She tried to frame me. She was going to tell everyone I was stealing from you so that she could steal from you. She was going to destroy my life, my reputation, everything, for money?" "That was the plan," I confirmed, my own anger a cold, steady flame that fueled my resolve. "She underestimated us both, Thomas. She saw a weak son and a frail mother. She didn't see us." "What do we do now?" he asked again, stopping his pacing to look directly at me, his eyes locking onto mine, seeking direction, seeking a plan of attack.
Do we call the police? Do we call her and confront her? No, I said, standing up to meet his gaze. My voice was firm, the voice of a CEO giving a direct order. We do not call her. We do not warn her. A good general never, ever tells the enemy when they are about to attack. She has made her move, a foolish and desperate one, and now we make ours tonight. He looked surprised, the immediacy of my timeline catching him off guard. Tonight? What's the plan? What do we do? The plan is simple, I said, my mind, the strategist's mind, clicking into high gear, processing variables and outcomes. We are going to her. We are going to your home, to my home, and we are going to end this. But we will do it on our terms, with our evidence, in a way that gives her absolutely no room to escape. I pointed to the folders on the table. This is our ammunition. But it's not enough to just show her these papers. We need to present a united front. When she looks at you, she cannot see a single shred of doubt or weakness. She needs to see that you are with me, completely and without reservation. Can you do that, Thomas? Can you face her and be the man she never thought you could be?
He won't see any doubt, he vowed, his voice raw with conviction. After what I just heard, after what she tried to do to you, to me, there's nothing left for her. It's over. The words seemed to hang in the air, the finality of his marriage, the certainty of the impending divorce settling around us like dust. I nodded, satisfied. This was the son I knew was in there. Good. Then here is what will happen. I spent the next hour laying out the strategy for him, not as a mother, but as a business partner. I spoke to him with the same clarity and precision I would have used when briefing Richard on a multi-million-dollar acquisition. I explained the sequence of revelations we would employ, the specific pieces of evidence we would present, and the final, irrefutable checkmate I had been holding in reserve. I made him go through the folders again, page by page. I wanted him to internalize the full scope of her deception, not just the financial statements that proved my wealth, but the other, more insidious evidence I had collected. There were printouts of her carefully curated social media posts, where she vaguely referenced dealing with difficult family members and the struggles of being a caregiver, subtly building her martyr narrative for her online friends. There were dated and timed entries from my private journal documenting her cruelest remarks, her most condescending insults. "But Mom, this is still just our word against hers," Thomas said, a flicker of his old uncertainty returning as he looked at the journal entries. "She'll lie. She'll say you're a bitter old woman making things up because you never liked her." "She will," I agreed, "which is why we have something she can't deny." I walked to my closet, a place filled with the drab costumes of my other life, and pulled out a small, unassuming shoebox from the top shelf. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a small, sleek, digital voice recorder. "This has been sitting on the bookshelf in your living room for the past 6 months. It's motion-activated. It looks like an air freshener." Thomas's eyes widened in disbelief. "I have a recording of the conversation you all had last week about my outdated furniture. I have a recording of her complaining bitterly about your salary. And I am quite certain," I said, a grim smile touching my lips, "that I have a recording of her telling you to coach me on what to wear to dinner on Friday night." He sank back into his chair, stunned into silence. "You've been recording her?" "I've been protecting myself," I corrected him firmly. "When someone is actively trying to paint you as mentally incompetent, you'd be surprised what measures you're willing to take to preserve the truth." The alliance was now forged. It was built not just on the emotional bond between a mother and son, but on the cold, hard foundation of the evidence I had so meticulously and patiently gathered. His shame was being burned away, replaced by a grim, righteous resolve. He finally understood the depth of the game Victoria had been playing, and the even deeper,
more complex game I had been forced to play in response. He saw that this wasn't about a mother testing her son's love anymore. This was about a mother protecting her son from a predator he had unwittingly invited into their lives, a predator who was about to devour them both. "Okay," he said, his voice finally firm, clear, and resolute. "I'm ready. Let's go." As we prepared to leave the small apartment that had been my stage and my sanctuary for 3 long years, I took one last look around. It had served its purpose. I felt no attachment to the worn-out furniture or the chipped mugs. They were just props in a play that was about to have its final, dramatic act. I turned to my son, my hand on the doorknob. "There's one more thing you need to know before we go. The final piece of the puzzle." "What is it?" he asked. "The house," I said, meeting his eyes, letting the full weight of the words sink in. "The one you live in, the one she thinks is her castle." I paused. "I bought it for you and Victoria as a wedding gift. It's in my name. It has always been in my name." Thomas didn't respond. He just stared at me, the weight of 100 different lies, both his and mine, finally crashing down on him with the force of a physical blow. He just nodded, a single, sharp, almost violent movement. The time for words was over. It was time for action. The drive to the house was the quietest, most charged 20 minutes of my life. Thomas drove my old, beat-up sedan, the widow's car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were bone white. He was a statue carved from silent fury, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the road ahead with an intensity that was almost frightening. I could feel the storm of emotions raging inside him without him having to say a word. The searing anger at his wife's betrayal, the profound, gut-wrenching shame of his own willful blindness. He was replaying years of his life in his head, every interaction, every conversation about me, every choice he made to appease her, now seen through a new, horrifying lens of truth. I didn't try to fill the silence with comforting words. He didn't need a mother's comfort right now. He needed this time to let the white-hot rage cool and settle into the cold, hard steel of resolve. My own mind, in contrast, was eerily calm, functioning with the detached precision of a surgeon. I felt like a general on the eve of a decisive battle. The strategy was set, the intelligence was gathered, the troops were aligned, and the objective was crystal clear. There was no more room for emotion, only for flawless execution. As we turned onto their street, my street, a quiet, tree-lined lane of perfect suburban homes, I finally broke the silence. "When we go inside, you let her lead the conversation," I instructed, my voice low and even. "She will be on the offensive. She will be incandescent with rage about Friday night. She will try to put us on the defensive, to make us the villains. Let her. Give her all the rope she needs to hang herself." Thomas nodded, not taking his eyes off the house as he pulled the car into the driveway. "And the recorder? The one from the living room?" "I have it," I said, patting my handbag. "Keep your phone in your pocket. Don't start recording unless she starts making direct threats or admitting to something new. We have more than enough. This is just insurance." But I had one more piece of insurance that she could never have anticipated, a final, invisible layer to my trap. After the chilling call from Mr. Albright, I had made another call to my security consultant, a brilliant and discreet man who had handled the complex systems for our commercial properties for years. I had asked him an unusual question. Could he, remotely, and without a trace, activate a live audio feed from the smart home devices, the speakers, the television, inside the house? He could, and he had. At that very moment, Mr. James Harrison, my lawyer, was sitting in his office, listening to every word, ready to act as a legally sworn witness to the entire confrontation. Victoria wasn't just walking into an argument. She was walking into a deposition she didn't know she was giving.
We got out of the car. The evening air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The house looked warm and inviting, a perfect picture of suburban domesticity, with a cheerful pumpkin on the porch and warm light spilling from the windows. It was a beautiful, meticulously crafted lie. Thomas stood by the car door for a moment, taking a deep, shuddering breath, like a man about to dive into icy, turbulent water. "I'm ready," he said, his voice a low growl. I walked over to him and placed a firm hand on his arm, forcing him to look at me. "Remember who you are, Thomas. You are not the weak, pliable man she married. You are not the silent coward who sat at the dinner table while his mother was being insulted. You are Richard Holloway's son. You are my son. Tonight, you act like it." He looked at me, and in the dim light from the porch, I saw the fire I had been hoping for, the steel I had been praying was still there. He nodded once, a sharp, determined gesture that conveyed more than words ever could. We walked up the stone path to the front door. Before he could even put his key in the lock, the door was wrenched open from the inside. Victoria stood there, framed in the doorway like a vengeful goddess. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her face a thundercloud of fury. She had clearly been waiting for us, pacing and stewing in her own venom. "Well, well, well, look what the cat dragged in," she spat, her eyes hard as black diamonds locking onto me with pure, undiluted venom. She was dressed for battle, in tight black jeans, sharp-heeled boots, and a structured blazer with shoulders like armor. "I've been waiting for you. You have a lot of nerve showing your face here after the disgusting scene you caused." She ignored Thomas completely, as if he were a piece of furniture, focusing all her rage on me. Perfect. This was exactly how I wanted it to begin. "Hello, Victoria," I said, my voice even and placid. I stepped past her into the foyer, my eyes sweeping over the living room with a proprietary air she was too enraged to notice. "The house looks lovely this evening." "Don't you dare play games with me," she snapped, closing the door behind us with a sharp, violent click that echoed in the entryway. "What was that on Friday night? That threat? Update my resume? What the hell is that supposed to mean, you crazy old woman?" Thomas stepped forward then, his presence suddenly immense, his voice low and steady. "Victoria, we need to talk." "Oh, we need to talk now?" she sneered, finally turning her fury on him. "Where was all this we talk on Friday when your ungrateful mother was insulting me in my own home? You just sat there like a spineless coward." "That's enough," Thomas said. The authority in his voice was so new, so absolute and unexpected that it actually made Victoria take an involuntary step back. She stared at him, for the first time, momentarily speechless. The board was set, the pieces were in place. I took a seat on the very sofa she called outdated, the sofa I had paid for, and folded my hands calmly in my lap, the very picture of serene composure. "Please, Victoria," I said, looking her directly in the eye, my voice soft and inviting, "tell us exactly what's on your mind. We're listening." She took the bait. Hook, line, and sinker. She began to pace the living room like a caged tiger, her voice rising in pitch and volume with every sentence. She launched into a long, rambling tirade about my disrespect, my lack of gratitude, my bizarre and senile behavior. She accused me of being jealous of her, of trying to drive a wedge between her and her husband. She painted herself as the long-suffering, patient, heroic daughter-in-law who had done nothing but try to help the crazy old woman who was determined to ruin her life. I let her talk. I let her spin her intricate web of lies and half-truths and delusions. Thomas stood by the fireplace, his expression as unreadable as granite, letting her expose the full depth of her poisonous narcissism. With every word, she was digging her own grave a little deeper, and I was just waiting for the perfect moment to hand her the shovel. Victoria's tirade finally sputtered out. She stood in the center of the room, her chest heaving, her face flushed with the heat of her self-righteous anger. She had exhausted her list of grievances, her litany of perceived wrongs. She planted her hands on her hips, a posture of defiant challenge. "So," she demanded, her voice sharp and brittle, "what do you have to say for yourself? After everything I've done for you, for this family, don't you think you owe me an apology?" I didn't answer her question. Instead, I looked at her with a calm, almost clinical gaze, the way I used to assess a failing business asset. "That was quite a performance, Victoria. Truly. You're very convincing." "It's not a performance," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "It's the truth, and your son knows it. He knows how difficult you've been." She spun around to face Thomas, her eyes pleading, then demanding. "Tell her, Thomas. For God's sake, tell her. Tell her how worried we've been about her mind. Tell her she's out of control." Thomas didn't move a muscle. He just looked at her, his expression as cold and flat as a frozen lake. "No," he said, the single word delivered with such quiet finality that it seemed to suck all the air out of the room. The simple, unequivocal refusal seemed to short-circuit her brain. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing silently like a fish gasping for air. What did you say?" "I said no," Thomas repeated, his voice gaining strength as he took a deliberate step forward, away from the fireplace and into the center of the conflict. "The performance is over, Victoria. We know everything." "Know everything?" she scoffed, a nervous, high-pitched tremor enter her voice. She tried to laugh, but it came out as a strangled bark. "What are you talking about? You're making no sense. Your mother has clearly gotten to you, filled your head with her paranoid, senile fantasies." "Paranoid fantasies?" I said, finally rising from the sofa. My movements were slow, deliberate, each one imbued with a sense of gravity. I walked to the polished coffee table and placed the first folder on its surface with a soft but decided thud. "You mean like the fantasy of you accumulating over $43,000 in secret credit card debt on shopping sprees, all while telling my son you were living paycheck to paycheck." Her face went white, the color draining away as if a plug had been pulled. She stared at the folder, then at me, her eyes wide with panic. How did you get that? That's private." "Or perhaps you mean the paranoid fantasy of you contacting an elder law attorney, a Mr. Lawrence Albright, to inquire about the legal process for having me declared mentally incompetent so you could gain control of my assets," I continued, my voice dangerously quiet, each word a precisely aimed dart. If she was white before, she was translucent now. "That's a lie. A vicious lie. I would never." "Really?" Thomas said, his voice dripping with a contempt so profound it was almost tangible. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his movements calm and practiced. He tapped the screen and played a short audio clip. It was Victoria's voice, captured in crystal clarity by the motion-activated recorder, speaking to him just last week. "I'm telling you, Thomas, we need to look into our legal options. She's a danger to herself. We need to get control before she wastes what little money your father left in his inheritance." The color flooded back into Victoria's face in a rush of panicked, cornered fury. "You were recording me? In my own home? That's illegal!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the phone. "What's illegal, Victoria?" I said, taking another step closer, my presence seeming to fill the room, "is conspiracy to commit fraud. What's illegal is filing a false police report, which I imagine was going to be your next brilliant move." I saw the flicker of confirmation in her panicked eyes, the silent admission that I had read her playbook perfectly. "You were going to tell the police that Thomas was abusing me financially, weren't you? all so you could step in and play the part of the heroic savior. She was cornered, trapped, with no way out. But like a cornered animal, her only instinct was to lash out. You can't prove any of this. It's just the ramblings of a crazy old woman and her spineless son. I'll sue you for slander. I'll get the best lawyer in the city. I'll take you for everything you have. Oh, will you be using Mr. Albright? I asked, my voice syrupy sweet. Because he had a rather illuminating phone call with me this afternoon. It seems he was a little too eager to land a new client and was careless with his words. My own lawyer, Mr. Harrison, has a full transcript. I'm sure the State Bar Association will find it fascinating reading. That was the final blow. Her last line of defense, her last bluff, had been called and obliterated. Her composure shattered completely, like a glass dropped on a marble floor. She sank into a nearby armchair, her body trembling uncontrollably. You bitch, she whispered, the words filled with a venomous, impotent hatred. You planned this. All of it. You've been playing me this whole time. I haven't been playing you, Victoria, I corrected her, my voice cold and clear. I have been giving you the space and the opportunity to reveal exactly who you are. And I must say, you did not disappoint. She looked up then, a wild, desperate, animalistic look in her eyes. She turned to Thomas, her last hope, the man she had molded and controlled for years. Please, Thomas, she begged, the tears she had been holding back finally starting to stream down her face, carving paths through her expensive foundation. She's trying to destroy our marriage, our life. This is our home. You can't let her do this to us. That's where you're wrong, Thomas, said his voice, devoid of any pity, any warmth, any of the love he had once felt for her. He looked at me, a silent question in his eyes, and I gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was time for the checkmate. I reached into my handbag and pulled out the final folded document. I walked to the table and unfolded it with a crisp, deliberate motion, placing it directly in front of her. It was the deed to the house. My name, Margaret Ann Holloway, was clearly printed under the heading Owner. This isn't your home, Victoria, I said, my voice calm and utterly final. It never was. I bought this house 7 years ago as a gift. You have been living here, in my house, as my guests. And now, visiting hours are over. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. Victoria stared at the deed, her mind refusing to process the words, the truth. Her entire world, the very foundation of her perceived status and her security, was not just a lie, but a gift she had spat upon. She looked up then, a crumpled mask of hatred and utter disbelief. You can't just kick me out. I have rights. You have no rights here, and I can, and I am. You have 30 minutes to pack a single bag with your personal belongings and get out of my house. If you are not gone by then, I will not hesitate to call the police and have you removed for trespassing. She screamed then, a raw, guttural, inhuman sound of pure rage and loss. Thomas, say something, for the love of God! Are you going to let her do this to me? Thomas looked down at the weeping, broken woman he had once promised to love and cherish, and for the first time he saw her for the complete and utter stranger she truly was. His voice was quiet, but it carried the force of a landslide, burying the last 7 years of his life. Get out, Victoria, he said. Get out of my mother's house. Victoria did not go quietly into the night. She didn't drift away in a cloud of remorseful tears. She left like a hurricane. For the next 20 minutes, the house, my house, was filled with the cacophony of her rage. We heard drawers being wrenched open and slammed shut. We heard the distinct crash of something glass being thrown against the wall.
We heard a series of high-pitched, hysterical sobs that were devoid of sadness. They were the raw, ugly sounds of thwarted ambition and utter defeat. Thomas and I stood in the living room, silent witnesses to the demolition of his marriage. He didn't speak. He just stared at the cold, dark fireplace, his expression grim, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I walked over and placed a hand on his arm. He didn't flinch or pull away. He simply covered my hand with his own and squeezed it tightly, a silent acknowledgement of our renewed, unbreakable bond. We were a team again, forged in the fires of betrayal. Finally, she came stomping down the stairs, dragging a large, ridiculously expensive designer suitcase behind her, its wheels clattering angrily on the hardwood steps. Her face was blotchy and swollen, her perfect makeup ruined by tears of pure fury. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at me. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice thick with a venomous malice that chilled me to the bone. "You think you've won, you smug old bitch, but you have no idea what you've just started. I will ruin you. I will make sure everyone knows what a manipulative, crazy monster you are. I will ruin both of you." "Goodbye, Victoria," I said, my voice a flat, emotionless wall she could not breach. She shot one last look of pure, unadulterated hatred at Thomas, a look that promised a world of pain. Then she wrenched the front door open and stormed out into the cold night, slamming it so hard the windows rattled in their frames and a picture on the wall tilted askew. The silence she left behind was profound. It was more than just quiet. It was a deep, cleansing peace. The poison had been drained from the house. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. "Mom," Thomas said. Finally, his voice hoarse, broken. "I am so sorry. For everything. For not seeing. For not listening. For being so weak." "I know you are, sweetheart," I whispered, my own voice thick with unshed tears. "I know."
In my naivete, I thought that would be the end of it. I thought she would slink away in her shame and disappear. I was wrong. I had underestimated the depths of her narcissism and the ferocity of a predator that has been wounded. She didn't just disappear. She launched a scorched earth campaign designed to destroy our credibility before we could establish our own narrative. The next morning, the call started, a coordinated and vicious assault. First, it was my sister-in-law, Patricia, her voice tight with a disapproval she made no effort to hide. "Margaret, Victoria called me in tears last night, hysterical. She said you threw her out of her own home. What in God's name has gotten into you?" "Did she happen to mention why, Patricia?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "She said you've gone mad, lying about being wealthy, making wild accusations. The poor girl is terrified of you." She'd squawked before I calmly hung up. Then it was Aunt Susan, her voice dripping with morbid, gossipy excitement. "Margaret, you'll never believe what I heard. Victoria had to flee for her life. She said you've completely lost your mind, that you're suffering from delusions of grandeur. Is it true you think you're a millionaire?" One by one, they called. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, old family friends. The story was the same, a masterfully twisted version of the truth. Poor, innocent Victoria had been the victim of her cruel, mentally unstable mother-in-law. In her version, I was the one obsessed with money, and my sudden lies about being wealthy were clear and definitive proof of my encroaching dementia. She claimed I had become paranoid and violent, and that she had to leave for her own safety. But she didn't stop with the family. 2 days later, Thomas came to see me at my real home, my penthouse apartment. He had been staying with me, unable to face the ghosts in his own house.
He walked in, his face pale, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "She called my boss," he said, his voice hollow, devoid of life. "She called Mr. Henderson at his home. She told him that you're suffering from a severe case of dementia and that I've been unstable and erratic at work because of the stress of handling your condition. She suggested they might want to review my recent projects and my overall job performance." The calculated, surgical cruelty of it was breathtaking. She wasn't content to destroy our family. She was actively trying to destroy his career, his ability to earn a salary, his very means of rebuilding his life. "What did Mr. Henderson say?" I asked, my heart aching for the burden my son was now carrying. "He was concerned," Thomas said, the word tasting like poison. "He suggested I look into taking some extended time off under the Family and Medical Leave Act. He thinks I'm dealing with a serious, long-term family medical crisis." But Victoria saved her final, most desperate, and ultimately most foolish strike for last. It came exactly 1 week after she'd been thrown out of the house. I was sitting in my home office, having a conference call with my investment team in London, when I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Detective Sarah Martinez of the City Police Department, asking me to call her back regarding a serious report that had been filed. My heart didn't sink. It hardened into a diamond. This was it, the serpent's last strike. I calmly finished my conference call, then dialed my lawyer. "James," I said, the moment he answered, "it's time. Phase 2. Victoria just filed a false police report." There was no surprise in his voice, only a grim satisfaction. "I've been expecting it. The complete file is ready to go. I'll meet you at the precinct in 45 minutes. I walked to my closet, pushing past the ghost of my thrift store wardrobe, the drab costumes of a life I would never live again. I selected a beautifully tailored, razor-sharp navy blue suit. I clasped the simple, elegant pearl necklace Richard had given me for our 30th anniversary around my neck. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The grieving, vulnerable widow was gone forever. In her place was Margaret Holloway, CEO, strategist, and a woman who was about to bring the full and righteous force of the law down on the person who had tried to destroy her family. I was not just going to answer questions. I was going to end this war. The police station was a drab, soulless place, smelling of stale coffee, antiseptic cleaner, and quiet desperation. It was a world away from my polished corporate offices, but I felt strangely at home. I was there to conduct business. Detective Sarah Martinez, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s with intelligent, weary eyes, led my lawyer and I into a small, windowless interview room. I could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes as she took in my appearance. My tailored suit, my understated pearls, Mr. Harrison's expensive leather briefcase. I was clearly not the frail, confused, and victimized elderly woman she had been expecting based on Victoria's frantic report. "Mrs. Holloway," she began, all business, as she consulted a file on the metal table between us. "As I mentioned on the phone, a Miss Victoria Holloway has come to us today and painted a very disturbing picture. She claims you are in a state of severe cognitive decline and that your son, Thomas, is controlling your finances, stealing your assets, and has forced you into substandard living conditions against your will. And what evidence, precisely, did she provide to support these very serious allegations?" Mr. Harrison asked, his voice smooth and professional, cutting through the stale air.
The detective slid a thin folder across the table. It contained the grainy photos of my small, drab apartment, the ones I knew Victoria had taken through the windows like a common stalker. It also contained a set of crudely doctored bank statements, showing only my small household expense account with its perpetually low balance. She claimed,
This is a significant discrepancy, Mrs. Holloway, she said, her professional tone now tinged with a dawning disbelief and a hint of respect. The apartment was a costume, detective, I explained calmly, a prop in a 3-year investigation to determine the true character of the people closest to me after my husband's death. My former daughter-in-law, I'm afraid, failed the test in a truly spectacular fashion. For the next hour, we didn't just defend ourselves, we went on the offensive. We laid out the entire sordid story, backing up every claim with irrefutable proof. Mr. Harrison presented the certified evidence of Victoria's secret credit card debt, a testament to her greed. I provided the printouts of her emails to the elder law attorney, a chilling window into her premeditated fraud. We played the crystal-clear audio recording of her plotting to have me declared incompetent, her voice filling the small, grim room with her own treachery. We showed the detective the actual deed to the house she had claimed was hers, my name clearly listed as the sole owner. The final, crushing piece of evidence was a sworn and signed affidavit from Mr. Albright, the elder law attorney himself. Upon being contacted by Mr. Harrison and informed of the potential for him to be implicated in a criminal fraud case, he had become remarkably cooperative, eager to provide a full account of Victoria's inquiries to save his own skin. By the time we were finished, Detective Martinez was silent. She sat back in her chair, slowly closing my binder. Then she used one finger to push Victoria's flimsy folder of lies to the far side of the table, a gesture of dismissal. She looked at me, her expression now one of grim understanding. Mrs. Holloway, filing a false police report is a serious crime. Attempted fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud are felonies. I am aware of that, detective, I said, my voice as cold as steel, and I wish to press charges to the fullest extent of the law. I also want a permanent restraining order issued, preventing her from ever contacting me, my son, or any member of our family again. The detective nodded slowly, a grim finality in her eyes. I'll have to present this to the district attorney's office, but based on the mountain of evidence you've provided, I don't think that would be a problem. I believe we have everything we need. 2 hours later, as I was sitting on the terrace of my real home, the penthouse apartment that overlooked the entire city, my phone rang. It was Detective Martinez. "Mrs. Holloway?" she said, her voice crisp. "Just wanted to let you know. We have arrested Victoria Holloway. She is in custody." The 6 months that followed were about rebuilding, about letting the light back in. The legal battle was swift and decisive. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence and the testimony of her own lawyer against her, Victoria pleaded guilty to filing a false report and attempted fraud. She was sentenced to 6 months in county jail and 3 years of probation. She had to pay restitution for the legal costs her lies had generated. The divorce between her and Thomas was finalized without a single complication. The family was a different story, a more complex tapestry to reweave. Some, like Patricia and Aunt Susan, called with tearful, shame-faced apologies once the full, sordid truth came out. I accepted them with grace, but I knew those relationships would never be the same. The trust had been broken too easily, their loyalty too shallow. A line had been drawn. Thomas, however, blossomed. Freed from the suffocating weight of Victoria's toxic influence, he began to resemble the confident, happy, creative man his father had been. He left the soul-crushing corporate marketing firm and, with my blessing and a small part of his real inheritance, started his own boutique graphic design company. He was brilliant, and for the first time in his adult life, he was working for himself, on his own terms, his passion reignited. He also started dating again. Her name was Rebecca, a kind, funny, down-to-earth elementary school teacher who drove a 10-year-old Honda and thought a fancy date was going to the Olive Garden.
She knew nothing about our money. She just knew Thomas was a good man with a kind heart who made her laugh. When he finally introduced us over a casual lunch, she was nervous to meet me, not because of any perceived wealth, but simply because I was his mother. She didn't ask about our house or our finances. She asked about Richard. What was he like? What made him laugh? She wanted to know the man who had raised the man she was falling for. I knew then, with a certainty that filled my heart with a profound peace, that my son was finally safe. Last week, I sold the house where he and Victoria had lived. I gave the entire proceeds from the sale to Thomas. He thanked me, his eyes filled with a gratitude that was deeper than words. Then he did something that made me prouder than any multi-million-dollar business deal ever had. He took half the money and, with the help of Mr. Harrison, established a secure college fund for the future children he hoped to have with Rebecca. And with the other half, he established the Richard Holloway Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing grants and mentorship to young and aspiring entrepreneurs. My husband's legacy, I realized, wasn't just in the money he had left behind, it was in the character of the son we had raised. It had just taken a painful, elaborate 3-year charade to strip away the poison and let that character finally shine through. I look back on those 3 years of living a lie, and I don't feel a shred of regret. It cost me time. It cost me my innocence about the darker parts of human nature. It cost me relationships I once valued. But it saved my son. It protected the life and the legacy Richard and I built together. And it taught me that I am stronger, smarter, and more resilient than I ever knew. I am not a victim. I am not a widow to be pitied. I am Margaret Holloway, and I am finally, completely, and unapologetically free to be myself.